Welcome to this Innovation Fund tutorial. In this tutorial, we will walk you through an example of the application of the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Calculator tool for an energy storage project. During the application for the Innovation Fund 2023 call, project proposals are assessed against several criteria. Greenhouse gas emissions, or GHG emissions avoidance, is one of them. Applicants must estimate the greenhouse gas emissions avoidance based on the Innovation Fund's GHG methodology and using the relevant Excel calculator tool. Both are published on the Funding and Tender portal. If you haven't already done so, we recommend reading the greenhouse gas methodology before watching this tutorial. If you still have questions after watching this tutorial, consult the FAQs in the Funding and Tender portal or contact our dedicated help desk. The Energy Storage Calculation tool comprises 14 tabs. Some are informative, others are for mandatory completion. On the first Overview tab, you can find overall instructions about the tool and the color coding to identify mandatory cells. As shown in this table, on the left-hand side, any information, activity data or consumption data shall be inserted in blue cells. Light green cells indicate fields where there is a formula or links embedded, so no inputs are required. Yellow cells indicate a drop-down menu, so you shall select the appropriate option. Finally, grey cells are for comments and other information about the data entered. The content of each tab is detailed at the bottom of this tab. This tutorial focuses on 4 main tabs: the 3 tabs that support your calculation, the Reference Emissions tab, the Project Emissions tab, and the Assumptions tab, and the Summary tab, which is populated automatically with your inputs from the other 3 tabs to give you the values you need to insert in your application. It is in the Summary tab that you will have to enter general information about the setup of the project. Let's start with this. I have pre-filled some information here. In our hypothetical project, the applicant proposes building a manufacturing plant for innovative battery packs with fast charging of up to 250 kilowatt DC to be used in electric vehicles, or EVs. The plant is planned to have an annual production capacity of 50,000 battery packs, corresponding to a total storage capacity of 18 terajoules. The operation will start in 2025, reaching full scale in 2026. In the drop-down for the principal product, I thus choose batteries and their components, and accordingly for the sector, I choose manufacturing of components for energy storage. I note here that due to the focus on use in EVs, this example project would also be eligible under the sector road transport. So please choose your sector carefully, considering the provisions and guidance in the call and the GHG methodology document. To support the calculation of your reference and project emissions, you will need to adopt assumptions to predict your operational performance because your project is not yet up and running. You must document these assumptions in the dedicated Assumptions tab, where you must also detail the source or the rationale for any qualitative or quantitative assumption adopted. Failure to explain assumptions or the use of unrealistic ones will be treated as a serious weakness and could lead to project application failure. So let's switch to the Assumptions tab now. For this tutorial, I have also pre-filled this tab with assumptions we will use for our illustrative calculation of the hypothetical project. I reiterate that the project proposes to produce 50,000 battery packs per year. The GHG methodology requires to factor in the cost share of the innovative component, in this case the battery pack, in the total vehicle price, which I set to 15% based on an up-to-date database. To estimate the avoided fossil fuel consumption, I need assumptions about the electricity used by an EV per kilometre, which I took from the same database, and about the average travel distance of an EV, which can be found at the end of Section 5 of the GHG methodology. In the calculation of the project emissions, you will only need to consider the emissions from the operation of the EVs, not from the production of the battery packs. We therefore need no further assumptions for the project scenario here. Now that we have outlined our project and documented the assumptions, Let's move to the Reference Emissions tab to calculate the emissions avoided by the project being put in place. Before you start, I recommend you go through the parameters to understand what each of them refers to. Do not feel alarmed with the number of rows. You will only have to complete those that apply to your project. Basically, there is one entry per type of energy stored: electricity, heat, hydrogen, other. And for additional grid services provided by energy storages. The provision of grid services is not relevant in our example. Nonetheless, I would like to mention that there is no default emission factor provided for these. If relevant for your project, you must explain your calculations and provide credible evidence to underpin your figures. This may be done via the Assumptions tab. As mentioned before, blue cells indicate the fields you will fill yourself. In our example here, the electricity stored in the battery packs for use in the transport sector, e-transport, is the only relevant energy consumption, because the reference emissions are derived from the fossil fuels replaced by the use of the batteries, not their production. In line 18, I calculate the annual electricity use of a single EV by multiplying the specific consumption and the travel distance I put down in the Assumptions tab. Note that I have pre-filled the cells for the first 2 years accordingly, linking the relevant cells in the formula and adjusting the unit to terajoule, TJ. Copying this for all years, I end up with 0.0098 terajoule in each year. However, since we are considering a manufacturing project, the calculation requires also taking into account the number of EVs equipped with batteries, by changing this section below, row 31 and 32. In row 32, I simply plug in the share of the battery cost in the total vehicle price from the Assumptions tab for all years. In row 31, I have to calculate the number of produced battery packs accumulated over the years. So I add the annual production in the given year to the production in the years before. In the first year, I take into account that the plant is running only at 50% of its full capacity. As you see, the number of total batteries produced steadily increases, reaching 475,000 in the 10th year. You may notice that avoided emissions are now showing up in the green cells on the right. The cells on the right from column S onwards multiply the yearly consumption by the number of batteries produced and their share in the total costs. The default emission factor for the fossil fuels replaced, in this case diesel, taking into account the 3 times higher efficiency of energy use compared to combustion engines, with the latter two predefined in the Conversion Factor tab. This is all the data that is required to calculate the reference scenario emissions. Now that I have filled all the parameters, let's check that numbers appeared properly in the calculation columns. To do this, go to the top of the table to check that all the reference emissions have been captured and summarized. Having calculated the reference emissions, we will now calculate the project emissions. The Project Emissions tab is organized in the same manner as the Reference Emissions tab. On top, you will see a summary of the project emissions for each parameter. When scrolling down, you will see one row per input to the energy storage: electricity, heat, hydrogen, other. In addition, there are rows for the on-site emissions from fuel combustion in stationary and mobile sources, as well as rows for on-site fugitive emissions of greenhouse gases. Again, I recommend you go through all the parameters first to understand what each of them refers to. Now let's start populating the cells with our project data. Again, I have pre-filled the data for the cumulated number of battery packs produced and the share of their cost in the total vehicle price in exactly the same way as in the reference scenario. Moreover, the electricity consumed by one EV in the first year is determined in the same way as before. Assume it to be the same for all years again. I end up with the same total consumption. In turn, the calculated emissions remain zero in this case, because the emission factor for electricity consumed by the project is zero by default, as can be seen in the Conversions tab. Before we move to the next steps, I want to show you that the tab allows you to put additional information about the traceability of the data. In this field, you must provide a brief description of your monitoring plan. For instance, it may include procedures for data collection as well as roles and responsibilities. Having calculated your reference and project emissions, the indicators informing the two GHG emissions avoidance criterion will be automatically calculated by the spreadsheet in the Summary tab. The absolute GHG emissions avoidance calculated as the difference between reference and project emissions. And the relative GHG emissions avoidance, which is calculated by dividing the absolute reductions by the reference emissions. In this case, 100%. You should carefully check that these numbers are plausible and in agreement with your expectations. Please also note that projects must meet a minimum 50% GHG emissions avoidance to be considered eligible. If all of this is the case, congratulations! You have successfully used the calculator tool. You should now use these for application form B and C. We invite you to revisit the calculator at your own time, particularly to familiarize yourself with the additional tabs that are part of the calculation tool, such as the 3 tabs colored green related to bonus points, the net carbon removals, additional renewable electricity, and the other GHG emissions avoidance, in which you can claim for emissions reductions beyond those covered by methodology. There is a checklist for you to self-assess whether you have adopted the best practices for the preparation of your application. I hope you find this tutorial useful. If after this tutorial and reviewing the tool you still have questions, please do not hesitate to submit a question via the help desk if the answer to your question is not included in the FAQ available on the Funding and Tender portal. Please note that the help desk can only answer questions related to the methodology or the utilization of the tool. Our team will not review calculations or validate assumptions that you intend to use for your project. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.